On the morning of her 36th birthday, Emma Carter woke before dawn and lay still, listening to the wind push the last dry leaves across the pavement outside her window. She had mailed out 18 invitations that week, each one written by hand, because she still believed that a handwritten note meant something in a world that had grown careless with attention. By the time the sun climbed over the rooftops of the small town, she had already pictured the evening ahead, a warm room filled with familiar laughter and the soft clinking of glasses. 3 hours later, sitting alone in a corner booth with a small cake in front of her, she would learn exactly how wrong that picture had been when she finally reached for the handles of her wheelchair to leave quietly through the back door. The front door of the restaurant swung open instead. A stranger walked in carrying an old wooden box under one arm, and what he did in the next few minutes would leave the entire room in silence. Emma had lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of town for almost 3 years, ever since the accident that took the use of her legs, and, not long after, the husband who had once promised to stay through anything. The apartment was modest but carefully arranged, every shelf lowered to a height she could reach. Every doorway widened, just enough for her chair to pass through, without a struggle. She had been an architect once, a good one, the kind whose drawings other people trusted with their homes and their futures. Now most of her days moved at a slower pace, filled with small routines that she had built for herself out of necessity, and eventually, out of quiet pride. On the morning of her birthday, she woke early and spent nearly 2 hours getting ready, far longer than the occasion required. But she wanted the day to feel important. She tried to bake a cake from a recipe she remembered from childhood, only to watch it collapse in the oven, the batter sinking in the middle no matter how carefully she had measured everything. She laughed a little at herself, wiped the flour from her hands, and drove to the corner bakery instead, where she bought a small cake with pink icing and her name written across the top in careful cursive. Back home, she opened the closet and found the blue dress she used to wear before the accident, the one that had hung untouched for 3 years because she had never quite found the courage or the occasion to put it on again. She slipped it over her shoulders slowly, adjusting the fabric where her body had changed, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment before deciding that she looked, if nothing else, like someone who still believed good things could happen to her. On the dresser beside her sat a stack of old photographs, faces from a life that used to be full of noise, colleagues from the architecture firm, friends from college, a wedding photo she had never found the strength to put away. She looked through them slowly, then set them down and picked up her phone to send one last reminder to the group of people she hoped would come that evening. The restaurant she had chosen sat near the edge of downtown, a quiet place with warm lighting and wide aisles between the tables, one of the few in town that had never made her feel like an inconvenience. She had reserved a table for 8, imagining old friends filling the empty chairs, and she arrived early so she could greet each guest with a smile instead of an apology for being late. The waiter set the small cake in the center of the table and lit a single candle, and Emma folded her hands in her lap and waited, watching the door every time it opened. 30 minutes passed, then a full hour, and still no one came through that door for her. She checked her phone twice, believing perhaps a message had simply failed to arrive, but the screen stayed quiet, except for 2 brief texts wishing her a happy birthday from people who clearly had no intention of showing up in person. 2 hours in, the waitstaff began quietly clearing the extra place settings around her, folding the unused napkins and carrying away chairs she no longer needed, and Emma kept her eyes fixed on the candles so she would not have to watch them do it. She told herself that people got busy, that traffic could be bad, that maybe there had been some misunderstanding about the date, and she repeated these small excuses to herself until they no longer felt convincing. By the 3rd hour, the restaurant had grown quiet around her, most of the other tables empty as the evening wound down, and Emma finally allowed herself a single tear, which she wiped away quickly before anyone could see it fall. She thought back, almost against her will, to birthdays before the accident, dinners crowded with co-workers from the firm, a table too small for all the people who had once wanted to be near her. She wondered, sitting there with the candle burning lower by the minute, exactly when those same people had decided that a woman in a wheelchair was somehow less worth their time than the woman she used to be, though she could never pinpoint a single moment where the shift had happened. It had simply crept in slowly. One missed call after another, one cancelled visit after another, until the absence became a kind of permanent weather she had learned to live inside without complaint. She reached for the wheels of her chair, deciding it was time to go home before the humiliation could grow any larger. And that was the exact moment the front door opened one last time. Daniel Brooks had not planned to walk into that restaurant at all that evening. He ran a small workshop on the other side of town, where he built furniture and custom pieces by hand. And he had arranged to deliver a carved wooden box to a client who was supposed to be dining there with his family. The client had called an hour earlier to cancel, apologizing for the short notice, but Daniel had already driven halfway across town and decided he might as well drop the box off anyway, rather than waste the trip. When he stepped inside, the restaurant was nearly empty. The lights dimmed low for the end of the evening, and his eyes landed almost immediately on the woman sitting alone near the window, a small cake in front of her with a candle burned down almost to nothing. At first, he only meant to greet the host and leave the box at the counter. But something about the stillness of the woman's posture made him pause. He noticed the cake more closely then, the careful pink lettering that spelled out a name across the top. "Happy birthday, Emma." And he realized all at once what he was looking at. He walked closer than he probably should have for a stranger, and asked gently whether everyone else had already gone home for the night. Emma looked up, startled, and managed a small laugh that did not quite reach her eyes as she said that her friends were probably just busy. That these things happen sometimes. Daniel did not need her to say anything more than that. The empty chairs around the table told him everything the polite words were trying to hide. He asked, carefully, whether she would mind if he sat down for just a few minutes. And Emma, surprised by the kindness of a total stranger, found herself nodding before she had fully decided to say yes. They began to talk, slowly at first, the way two strangers do when neither wants to overstep an invisible line. But the conversation eased into something warmer as the minutes passed. Daniel told her a little about his workshop, the pieces of furniture he built by hand, the quiet satisfaction of turning raw wood into something a family would use for decades. Emma found herself relaxing in a way she had not expected, grateful simply to be spoken to like an ordinary person rather than someone to be handled with careful sympathy. As the conversation continued, Daniel learned more about the woman across the table than he had expected to in a single evening. She told him, without much drama in her voice, that she had once worked as an architect, designing buildings that people still walked past every day without knowing her name. She explained, in the same even tone, that a car accident 3 years earlier had taken the use of her legs, and that, not long after, her husband had decided he could not build a life around what she had become. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the friends who once filled her weekends had slowly stopped calling, first with excuses, then with silence, until she had simply stopped expecting them to call at all. What struck Daniel most was not the sadness in her story, but the complete absence of bitterness in the way she told it. She spoke about her ex-husband without anger, about her old friends without blame, as though she had made peace with a version of events that most people would have raged against for years. He found himself admiring her more with every sentence, not out of pity, but out of something closer to respect for a person who had been knocked down hard and had still found a way to sit up straight in a wheelchair on her own birthday. When the evening finally came to an end and Emma prepared to leave, Daniel quietly stopped the waiter on his way to the register and paid the entire bill before she could reach for her own wallet. He asked the staff not to mention it to her, wanting the gesture to remain simply an act of kindness rather than something that required thanks. Emma left that night, believing the modest bill had already been settled by the restaurant's own goodwill, never realizing that a stranger she had known for less than an hour had quietly taken care of her in a way no one from her old life had managed to do all evening. She rolled out into the cool night air feeling lighter than she had in weeks, not because her circumstances had changed in any real sense, but because a single unexpected conversation had reminded her that kindness still existed somewhere in the world, even if it had chosen, of all people, to arrive in the form of a furniture maker delivering a box no one had asked for. She thought about him on the drive home, wondering briefly whether their paths would ever cross again, then set the thought aside as the kind of pleasant but unlikely coincidence. that rarely repeats itself in real life. A full week passed before their paths crossed again, this time by simple chance rather than any plan on either side. Emma had wheeled herself to her favorite coffee shop downtown, a small corner place run by a woman named Linda, who always kept a low table near the window free for her, and she was settling in with her usual cup of tea when the door opened and Daniel walked in. He seemed just as surprised as she was, offering a warm smile of recognition before asking if he could join her for a few minutes. And Emma, without much hesitation this time, gestured toward the empty seat across from her. Daniel had walked in that afternoon simply to order his usual black coffee before heading back to the workshop, having no idea Emma would be sitting near the window with a book open in her lap. When he spotted her, he hesitated only a moment before crossing the room, telling himself it would be rude not to say hello to someone he had shared such an honest conversation with only a week earlier. Their conversation that afternoon lasted far longer than either of them expected, stretching well past the time Daniel had originally planned to spend on his coffee break. They talked about small things at first: the changing weather, the shops along Main Street, the particular way autumn light fell across the old brick buildings downtown, but underneath the small talk, there was an ease neither of them had felt with another person in a long while. Linda, watching from behind the counter, noticed the way Emma laughed more freely than she had in months, and quietly refilled their cups without being asked. In the weeks that followed, Daniel found small reasons to check in on Emma, never presenting his visits as anything more than simple, neighborly kindness. When one of the wheels on her chair began sticking, he offered to take a look at it himself, disappearing into his workshop for an afternoon and returning it running smoother than it had in over a year. When she mentioned struggling to reach the higher shelves of her bookcase, he showed up with a set of custom brackets he had built to lower the shelves to a comfortable height, refusing any payment beyond a cup of coffee for his trouble. He installed handrails along the narrow hallway of her apartment without being asked twice, measuring twice, and cutting once the way his father had taught him decades earlier. He carried in groceries when her hands were full, fixed a cabinet door that had been hanging crooked for months, and never once made her feel as though these small acts of help were anything unusual or worth a great deal of gratitude. He also had a habit of showing up at odd, unglamorous moments, rather than only during planned visits, appearing with a bag of groceries on a rainy afternoon simply because he happened to be passing the store, or dropping off a spare part for her chair before she had even finished describing the problem over the phone. Once, when a storm knocked out power across her side of town for nearly 2 full days, he arrived within the hour carrying a portable heater and a thermos of hot soup, waving off her protests with the simple explanation that he had nothing better to do that evening anyway. Linda, watching the pattern unfold over several weeks from behind the counter of her coffee shop, began teasing Emma gently about the frequency of Daniel's visits, though Emma always brushed the comments aside with a laugh and an insistence that they were simply friends. What Emma noticed most, and what moved her more than any of the individual favors, was that Daniel never once treated her as fragile, or as someone to be handled carefully because of what had happened to her. He argued with her about small things, the way he might argue with any friend, teased her gently when she insisted on doing a task herself rather than accepting help, and spoke to her exactly as he would speak to anyone else he respected. There was no careful softening in his voice, no hesitation before mentioning her wheelchair or her old career, no awkward pause before laughing at something funny she said. For the first time in 3 years, Emma began to feel like a whole person again, rather than a situation that other people had to carefully navigate around. What Emma did not yet know was that Daniel understood the particular loneliness she carried far better than she realized, because he had walked through his own version of it years earlier. His wife had passed away from a long illness when he was still a relatively young man, leaving him alone in a house that had once been full of 2 people's plans for the future. For a long stretch of time after her death, he had barely spoken to anyone outside of what his work required, sinking into a heaviness that he later came to understand as depression. Though at the time he had no name for it, beyond simply feeling as though the color had drained out of everything. It had been his workshop, strangely enough, that pulled him back toward the surface. There was something steadying about the repetitive motion of sanding a plank of wood smooth, about watching a shapeless piece of lumber slowly become a chair or a table under his hands, something that gave his days a structure when nothing else in his life seemed to hold any shape at all. Over time, the quiet discipline of the work became a kind of therapy he had never planned for, and though the grief never fully disappeared, it eventually settled into something he could carry without being crushed underneath it. One evening, sitting with Emma on the small porch outside her apartment as the sun dropped low over the rooftops, Daniel spoke more openly than he usually allowed himself to about those years after his wife's death. He told her, quietly, that there had been entire stretches of time when he genuinely believed the world would not notice if he simply disappeared from it, that no one would call to check on him, because no one had any particular reason to. Emma sat very still as he spoke, recognizing in his words the exact shape of a feeling she had carried herself every single day since the accident. The sense of being forgotten by a world that had simply moved on without waiting for her to catch up. Neither of them said very much after that confession, but something between them shifted permanently in the silence that followed, an unspoken understanding that neither of them was as alone in that particular pain as they had once believed. Daniel admitted, almost sheepishly, that in the earliest months after his wife passed, he had stopped answering his own phone for weeks at a time, letting calls from concerned relatives go straight to voicemail, because he simply did not have the energy to explain how he was doing, when the honest answer was that he was barely doing anything at all. He confessed that it had taken nearly 2 years before he could walk past certain shelves in the grocery store without his chest tightening, 2 years before an entire evening could pass without her absence pressing down on him like a physical weight. Emma listened without interrupting, recognizing in every sentence a mirror of her own private grief, and for the first time since the accident, she felt genuinely understood by another person, rather than merely tolerated or accommodated. It was not long after that evening that Daniel quietly began putting together a plan of his own, though he mentioned nothing of it to Emma at the time. He started by reaching out to people from her past, beginning with a former colleague at the architecture firm where she had once worked, a man who remembered her designs fondly, but had simply lost touch after she stopped coming into the office. From there, one contact led to another. Old classmates from her university program, a professor who had once called her one of the most promising students he had taught in 20 years. Clients whose homes she had designed, and who still lived happily inside the walls she had once drawn on paper. What Daniel discovered, conversation after conversation, was not a group of people who had deliberately abandoned Emma out of cruelty, but rather a scattered collection of individuals who had simply drifted away the way people often do when a friend's life takes a difficult turn and no one quite knows how to approach it. Many of them, when Daniel explained gently what had happened to Emma over the past 3 years, seemed genuinely stunned to learn how isolated she had become, admitting that they had simply assumed someone else was checking in on her. Several broke down on the phone, embarrassed by their own silence, insisting that they would do anything they could to make it right if given the chance. One former professor, a man who had taught Emma during her final year of architecture school, told Daniel that he still kept a framed print of her senior thesis project hanging in his office, and that he often used it as an example for new students of what genuine talent looked like on paper. A woman who had once shared an office with Emma explained, through tears, that she had drafted at least a dozen text messages over the past 3 years asking to visit, only to delete each one out of a strange fear that she would say the wrong thing or somehow make things worse by intruding. Daniel found, again and again, that the silence surrounding Emma had never been built from malice, but from a quiet, universal awkwardness that so many people feel around illness and disability, an awkwardness that convinces good people to do nothing at all, rather than risk doing something imperfectly. Over the following weeks, Daniel built a careful list of names, contacting each person individually, explaining what he hoped to organize, and asking for nothing more than their presence on a particular evening. He rented a modest hall on the edge of town, the kind of space usually reserved for community gatherings and small wedding receptions, and arranged for it to be ready on a date he chose, without telling Emma the real reason behind it. To her, he simply said that he wanted to take her out for dinner, a proper evening out to celebrate nothing in particular, and Emma, trusting him completely by that point, agreed without asking too many questions. He also spent several evenings quietly gathering old photographs and design sketches from Emma's early career, borrowing them from former colleagues who were only too happy to help once they understood what he intended to build. He spread these images across the workbench in his shop late at night, studying every angle of a small building Emma had designed years earlier, tracing the lines of windows and archways until he could see the structure clearly enough in his mind to recreate it in miniature. Sawdust collected on the floor around him for weeks as he shaped and sanded piece after piece, discarding attempts that did not meet his own quiet standard of precision, driven by a determination that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with love. On the appointed evening, Daniel arrived at her apartment, dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, and he drove them across town toward what she assumed was a quiet restaurant. When they pulled up outside the rented hall instead, string lights glowing warmly along its entrance, Emma felt a flicker of confusion that Daniel did nothing to explain. He wheeled her gently through the front doors, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the lights inside came up all at once, revealing more than 50 people rising to their feet in unison. The room erupted with a single unified greeting of gratitude and welcome, voices calling out her name from every direction. And Emma sat frozen in her chair for a long moment, unable to process what she was seeing. Scattered throughout the crowd were faces she recognized instantly. Former colleagues from the firm who had once admired her work from across a shared office. A college friend she had not spoken to in nearly 4 years. Clients whose homes still stood exactly as she had designed them. Teachers who remembered her as a gifted student stood beside neighbors who had simply lost touch after her accident. All of them gathered in one room for the sole purpose of telling her she had not been forgotten after all. Many of the guests approached her one by one throughout the evening, several with tears already forming before they reached her chair, apologizing for the silence that had stretched across the past 3 years, without any real explanation behind it. A former coworker admitted through tears that she had thought about calling dozens of times, but had never known what to say, so she had simply said nothing at all. A mistake she now deeply regretted. Emma found herself unable to speak for long stretches of the evening, overwhelmed by a version of gratitude so large, it left almost no room for words, managing only to squeeze each hand that reached for hers and nod through her own tears. Later in the evening, once the initial wave of greetings had settled and the guests had taken their seats around the room, Daniel stepped forward carrying the same old wooden box he had been holding the very first night they met at the restaurant. He set it carefully on a small table in front of Emma and asked her to open it herself. And the room grew quiet as she worked the simple latch and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of soft cloth, sat an intricate wooden model of a building, every window and archway carved with painstaking precision, a structure Emma recognized instantly as the very first project she had ever designed as a young architect fresh out of school. Daniel explained, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, that he had spent more than 3 months in his workshop, late at night, after Emma had gone to bed, working from old photographs he had gathered from her former colleagues, to recreate the building exactly as she had first imagined it on paper. Every detail had been carved by hand, from the small archway over the entrance to the pattern of brickwork along the sides, a labor of patience meant to honor the talent that Emma herself had almost stopped believing she possessed. He told the room, his eyes fixed on Emma rather than the crowd around them, that some people spend their lives building dreams for countless others without anyone stopping to build something back for them in return, and that tonight, it was finally their turn to do exactly that for her. The entire hall rose to its feet in a wave of applause that seemed to last far longer than any ordinary round of appreciation. Many of the guests wiping at their eyes as they clapped, and Emma sat in the center of it, all holding the small wooden model against her chest as though it were the most precious object she had ever owned. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something shift inside her chest, not the grief that had settled there since the accident, but something closer to hope, beginning to take root again. In the months that followed that evening, Emma began to rebuild her life in ways she had never imagined possible while sitting alone at that first birthday dinner. She could not stand on her own legs, but she found a different way to rise, one that did not depend on the strength of her body at all. She launched a small online consulting service, offering design guidance to young architects and homeowners who reached out from all across the country, drawing on the very skills that a car accident had never actually taken away from her. Word of her work spread quickly, aided in part by the story of her own resilience, and before long she found herself invited to speak at community events and professional gatherings about starting over after loss. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was a natural speaker, able to hold a room's attention not through polished performance, but through the simple honesty of someone who had genuinely lived through what she described. Design firms that had once forgotten her name began reaching out to ask for her collaboration, several offering partnerships that would have seemed impossible to imagine only a year earlier. She accepted a handful of these opportunities carefully, choosing projects that allowed her to work from home while still challenging her creatively, and within a matter of months, her calendar looked fuller than it had at any point since before the accident. She began mentoring a small group of young designers who had faced their own setbacks, some recovering from injuries, others simply struggling to find their footing in a competitive industry, and she found a particular satisfaction in guiding people through the exact kind of doubt she once carried herself. Grace, who had watched Emma's transformation unfold from the apartment next door over the better part of a year, often remarked that the woman rolling out to check her mail each morning barely resembled the withdrawn figure she used to glimpse through a half-closed curtain. Through all of this transformation, Daniel remained steadily present in her life, though he made a quiet habit of staying just out of the spotlight whenever credit for her success came up in conversation. When friends or reporters occasionally asked whether he deserved recognition for helping her rebuild everything she had lost, he would simply shake his head and insist that Emma had done every bit of the work herself, that all he had done was remind her of what she had never actually stopped being capable of. Emma, for her part, knew better than to fully believe his modesty. But she loved him a little more each time he deflected the praise away from himself. A full year passed after that first surprise gathering, and as autumn returned once again with its familiar chill and its carpet of fallen leaves, Emma's 37th birthday arrived on the calendar. This time, there was no quiet dread in the days leading up to it. No careful list of 18 invitations sent out with cautious hope. Because Emma no longer needed to wonder whether anyone would remember to come, Daniel had once again arranged the evening, though by now Emma had learned to expect at least a small surprise whenever he grew mysteriously quiet about his plans. The hall he had rented for the occasion stood filled to capacity long before Emma arrived. The same faces from the year before, joined now by even more names that had re-entered her life over the preceding months. A large cake sat at the center of the room, far grander than the small pink-frosted one she had once eaten alone. Surrounded by friends old and new, former colleagues, neighbors, and dozens of people whose lives she had touched through her design work and her speaking engagements. Several of the young designers she now mentored had traveled from neighboring towns just to be there, insisting they would not have missed the evening for anything, and one of them had written her a short note, thanking her for showing what it looked like to rebuild a career from nothing. Even the waiter who had once cleared the extra place settings from her very first birthday table, back when the restaurant still employed him part-time, had heard about the celebration through a mutual friend and stopped by briefly to wish her well. Grace, the neighbor who had quietly checked on her through some of the hardest months of the past 3 years, stood near the front of the crowd with tears already gathering in her eyes. Partway through the evening, as laughter and conversation filled every corner of the room, Daniel made his way toward the small stage at the front and asked, gently, for everyone's attention. The room fell quiet almost immediately, sensing that something significant was about to happen. And Emma watched with growing curiosity as he reached into the pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as he crossed the room toward her, and Emma felt her heart begin to race, even before she fully understood what she was witnessing. Daniel knelt down slowly in front of her wheelchair, bringing himself level with her eyes, rather than standing above her the way so many people instinctively did, without realizing the small unkindness in it. He told her, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, that on the very first night they met, all he had wanted was to make sure she never had to spend another birthday crying alone in an empty restaurant. He told her that somewhere along the way, that simple wish had grown into something far larger than he had ever expected. and that now what he truly wanted was to spend the rest of his life making sure she smiled far more often than she cried. She thought, in the brief silence before she managed to speak, of the long stretch of years when she believed no one would ever look at her the way Daniel was looking at her in that moment, without hesitation, without pity, without the careful distance so many others had kept. She thought of the empty chairs at that first birthday dinner, of the melted candle and the folded napkins carried away one by one, and of how impossible it would have seemed back then that a stranger walking through that same door would one day be kneeling in front of her, holding a ring. Emma pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, as the entire room seemed to hold its breath around her, waiting alongside Daniel for her answer. She nodded before she could even manage to speak the word aloud. And when she finally did whisper her answer, the hall erupted into applause, so loud it seemed to shake the walls themselves, friends and strangers alike, clapping and cheering as Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled just slightly, despite his usual steadiness. A few months later, as winter softened into an early spring, Emma and Daniel were married in a small and unhurried ceremony, surrounded by family, friends, and the very neighbors who had once nearly disappeared from her life entirely. The wedding was modest by most standards, held in a garden just beginning to bloom, but it held more warmth and genuine joy than either of them had ever expected to feel again after everything they had separately survived. Daniel built the wooden arch, under which they exchanged their vows with his own hands, carving small details into the wood that only Emma would recognize, tiny shapes echoing the model building he had once presented to her in front of 50 guests. She wore a pale ivory dress altered specifically to move easily with her chair, and she rolled down a short aisle lined with folding chairs rather than being pushed, insisting on turning her own wheels for at least that small stretch of the ceremony. Linda closed her coffee shop for the afternoon so she could attend, and Grace cried through nearly the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had brought specifically for that purpose. In the months following the wedding, Daniel took it upon himself to renovate the home they now shared together, widening doorways, lowering countertops, and building custom furniture with his own hands so that Emma could move freely through every room without needing assistance. He converted a sunlit corner of the house into a proper studio where she could continue her design work, complete with a drafting table built precisely to the height that suited her chair, shelves within easy reach on every side, and a wide window that let in soft morning light exactly where she liked to work. He spent an entire weekend adjusting the angle of that window alone, unwilling to settle for anything less than perfect once he realized how much time she planned to spend there each day. Emma often joked that he had built her a studio nicer than the one she used to rent above the old architecture firm, though she meant it as the highest compliment she could offer, and Daniel always accepted the teasing with a quiet, satisfied smile. It was, in many ways, the same quiet language of care he had always shown her, expressed now not through small gestures scattered across weeks but through the permanent architecture of an entire home. Together, the two of them eventually established a small foundation aimed at helping people with disabilities find meaningful work and reconnect with communities that had, for one reason or another, drifted away from them. They funded workshops similar to the one Daniel had once used to rebuild his own life, and they organized mentorship programs pairing skilled professionals with people whose careers had been interrupted by illness or injury, much as Emma's own career had once been interrupted by a single accident on a rainy highway. Neither of them sought recognition for the work, preferring instead to let the results speak quietly on their own, in the same way Daniel had once quietly paid a stranger's dinner bill without ever expecting thanks in return. The foundation grew slowly but steadily over the following 2 years, funded in part by donations from several of the same former colleagues and clients who had once drifted out of Emma's life, many of whom now considered it a small way of making amends for years of silence. Grace helped organize the first fundraising dinner herself, insisting on handling the invitations personally this time, joking that she would not rest until every single seat in the room was filled twice over. Linda kept a donation jar on the counter of her coffee shop for months afterward, telling every customer who asked about it the story of the woman who once sat alone with a small pink cake, and the stranger who had refused to let her stay that way. On quiet evenings, The two of them often sat together on the porch of their renovated home, watching the sun sink slowly behind the hills at the edge of town. Emma's chair drawn up close beside Daniel's seat, so their hands could rest together on the armrest between them. They rarely spoke much during these moments, having long since learned that comfortable silence between two people said more than most conversations ever could. It was in exactly this kind of stillness, watching the sky shift through shades of orange and violet, that Emma often found herself thinking back to that first lonely birthday, the empty chairs, the melting candle, the humiliation she had been so certain would define the rest of her life. She understood now, in a way she could not have understood then, that the deepest pain she had carried was never really about the wheelchair or the legs that no longer obeyed her, but about the quiet terror of believing the entire world had simply forgotten she existed. What had changed everything, in the end, was not a miracle cure or a sudden reversal of fortune, but the simple decision of one stranger to sit down in an empty chair on an ordinary evening and refuse to look away. Sometimes, she had come to believe, an entire life could pivot on nothing more dramatic than a single act of genuine kindness, offered by someone who expected nothing at all in return, and carried forward by a person brave enough to let herself be helped.